Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Robert Conrad, president and co-founder of WCLV, which has been broadcasting these forums since 1970. I'm also past vice president of the City Club. It's my pleasure to introduce today's forum, a panel discussion on bias, fake news, and the state of the Fourth Estate. Almost a year ago, we gathered in Public Square to discuss the electorate, the media, and the 2016 presidential election. At that time, we were beginning to see cracks in the public trust of mainstream media. There were accusations that media organizations were elevating or, in some cases, suppressing news pertaining to presidential candidates. Since Election Day, on both the right and the left, these cracks have only deepened. Almost daily, the mainstream media is accused of bias in some form or another, with serious repercussions. According to Gallup, America's trust in media has dropped 32%, its lowest level in Gallup polling history, including an 8% drop in the last year alone. This drop has coincided with the rise of so-called fake news, an old term describing deliberate or false information spread by traditional print or broadcast media. Today, it's not clear what exactly fake news means anymore. Our president uses it to refer to unfavorable news stories about him. So what are the implications of these shifts in perception and the deepening of these fissures? Will Americans ever again regain their trust in the mainstream media? And what does it mean for the future of the free press? Today, we've assembled a cadre of local and national leaders to discuss these issues. And leading our discussion is IdeaStream's Sound of Ideas host and Plain Dealer columnist, Michael K. McIntyre. A Cleveland native and graduate of Bowling Green State University, Mr. McIntyre has written for the Plain Dealer since 1990, covering government, transportation, crime, and the environment. And since 2002, he has written Tip-Off, a twice-weekly Metro column of assorted offbeat news items. This column won the 2010 Herb Cain Memorial Award for the National Society of Newspaper Columnists. So, Mr. McIntyre, I turn the forum over to you to introduce our esteemed panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Conrad. We have with us today an assembled group of national and local reporters, as you just heard, and I'm going to introduce them to you before we begin our conversation, because it's always good to know who we're talking to. We'll start with Ted Diadiun. He's to my left. He's a columnist and editorial writer for Cleveland.com, has held pretty much every editorial position at the Plain Dealer in his long career, and now, as I mentioned, is a columnist. He, I would say, is our most conservative member on the panel, likely, politically.
In every group. Yeah.
And gets a chance to prove that because he is an opinion columnist. Also with us is Henry J. Gomez. He's a political reporter for BuzzFeed News. You might recognize him as the longtime political reporter for the Plain Dealer, just recently transitioned to this national profile. Also here is Dr. John C. Green. He's director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. And Clare Malone, senior political reporter for FiveThirtyEight and a Shaker native. So let's hear it for our panel this morning. This afternoon. I want to say congratulations to the crowd here at the City Club. It is confirmed. It is the largest crowd in the history of a City Club event. Congratulations to all of you. Now, in saying that, I'm poking a little bit of fun at the president and his insistence that it was the largest crowd in the history of inaugurations. But my question is this. In making fun of that, in talking about the president's hyperbole, am I then biased in pointing out what I believe to be a fact, or what some might call an alternative fact? So I think maybe that's a good place for us to start, is the environment we're in regarding this particular president and the way he characterizes the media and characterizes facts, I wonder if that's playing into this media bias argument and this fake news argument. For example, here's a president who would call 4 of us on this stage has an enemy of the people, the media being an enemy of the people. Is it difficult to be an unbiased journalist? What effect does it have when you have somebody who's saying you're an enemy of the people? Does that color the argument here and the kind of coverage? Claire?
I think inherently, in practice, it has colored coverage. So one baseline thing I would say is facts are facts. But we live in an age where facts have been politicized, and you've seen this happening for a long time with, say, facts surrounding climate change or questioning things that are coming out of sort of academic studies. But I would say the president sort of exploited things. I would push back a little bit and say, here's one thing that everyone should know about reporters and people who do this for a living. Unlike doctors or lawyers, we don't have to stand before a bar or take a medical exam. We are kind of practicing our trade on your trust, and you have to have faith in us. And we are, as all human beings are, we have inherent biases. And so I think that's one thing that people don't give a little bit of leeway to on the media. So we can have our inherent human biases, but still cover something fairly, right? So I do think there is an important distinction between those things. I can be a woman and maybe have some inherent biases as a woman about the way I see the world, but I can also, I think, and I'm pretty sure I do, treat and write about my subjects in a fair way. So I think I think some of the good faith has been eroded on a national level because the president has turned reporters and columnists, but people who cover this daily, he's taken away some of that good faith that I think presidents have always had an adversarial relationship with the media, but Trump has gone to that nth degree and really sort of sucked the air out of the room.
Henry, is it the president that took away that good faith, or is it the media's response that's taking away that good faith?
Well, I think that the president has changed the rules of the game, and reporters are adapting, and some are adapting better and more responsibly than others. Claire's right on. Reporters, we all have our own personal beliefs, and we don't give them up when we go into journalism. The trick is being sure you can cover a given subject, political or otherwise, without throwing your bias into it. But I think that old adage that never pick a fight with somebody who buys ink by the barrel, though a lot of us live online, holds true. And when Donald Trump attacks a news organization or attacks a reporter individually or mixes it up with a news personality, there is oftentimes in human nature just a tendency to want to go after him even harder. And I think we see it to varying degrees play out. But conflict and adversarial relationships between politicians and office holders and the people who cover them is not new. I mean, I've been kicked out of a public meeting. I've been cut off from a gubernatorial campaign that didn't like my coverage. And I've persevered. I've continued to cover those people responsibly without letting, whatever static between us get in the way. And I do think it's harder to do that with Donald Trump because everything he does is bigger, everything he does is different, and there is no fair comparison between something that this president does and the last 44 presidents have done.
John Green?
Just to pick up on your point, Henry, Donald Trump not only is extraordinarily contentious, but he has mastered the new media very effectively. And through his use of Twitter and other things, but particularly Twitter, he's been able to dominate the news cycles to an extent that we haven't seen with previous presidents. Now, it may very well be that previous presidents wished they could have done that, but they didn't know how, right? And Trump has figured out how to do that. And I think that's put a lot of news organizations off balance because they don't quite know how to deal with that. And it's not just news organizations, it's opinion writers, it's other politicians, including a lot of people in the president's own party. He seems to always be a step ahead of everybody and therefore driving the agenda, and that means that in some sense he drives the coverage.
Ted Diadiun, do you believe that would be different if it were President Rubio or President Kasich?
I think it probably would, sure. Because as everybody has said here, Trump has ramped things up. But I've got to tell you, I was the reader representative, ombudsman for the Plain Dealer for 10 years, and I talked to thousands of readers every year, and this isn't a new thing, this mistrust in the media. This has been going on for a long time. That we heard some statistics before about the lack of trust and belief, but it's not. I think Trump has given people an avenue to express their unhappiness and their distrust more than invented it. Because I spent hours and hours talking to people, explaining why we did things the way we did, trying to show people that we were trying to play things down the middle and balancing. People would think that we were printing unflattering photos of somebody they liked and flattering photos of the opponents, and all these things, and the stories that we would choose and the headlines we would choose. So this has been out there. I really hate the term fake news, because fake news to me is the news you get where it said that that Trump supposedly told People magazine that if he ever ran for office, he'd run as a Republican because they were the stupidest people out there, and Barack Obama took the oath of office with his hand on the Koran. That's fake news. I think what people are mostly talking about, what Trump calls fake news, is biased news, and I think there is some of that out there, and there's more, I think, all the time. If you'll allow me 1 minute here, there's about a year ago, Jim Rutenberg, who's a media writer for the New York Times, media columnist, wrote a column that kind of put things right out there. He said, if you're a working journalist and if you believe that Donald J. Trump is a demagogue playing to the nation's worst racist and nationalistic tendencies, that he cozies up to anti-American dictators, and that he would be dangerous with control of the United States nuclear codes, how the heck are you supposed to cover him? Because if you believe all these things, you have to throw out the textbook American journalism has been using for the better part of the past half century and essentially inject your opinions into your news coverage. And I would say what you have to do if you believe that Trump is a bad guy and he can't be trusted as president, you have to excuse yourself from covering him and let somebody with a little bit more objectivity do
Clare,
it.
let's have Claire jump in first.
Okay.
I think journalists are operating on kind of two levels now in the Trump presidency. There's the idea that he is an unusual president. He's an unusual executive who breaks norms. Not everything in America is codified. We rely on institutional norms. So Trump is breaking those, and it's the job of journalists to keep tabs on him there. But the secondary and probably bigger problem that the media is dealing with is what led to the distrust now. It's taken 10 years for Americans' distrust in institutions. Banks, organized religion, the media, and Congress have all fallen as much as 22 points in distrust over the past 10 years. That's since 2006, which is a crazy drop in trust. And some of that, I think, is because of what we're covering in the press. So I'll back up and talk about, when Trump has a Twitter explosion, or Trump says anything during the campaign, those were events. There was a guy who wrote a book in the 60s called Daniel Bornstein, and the book was called The Image. And it was about how PR was a new industry, and that people in PR were creating news events, and that everyone was starting to glom onto these news events. So what I think for a long time, national political reporters probably in general are more susceptible to this was you would cover these kind of made up events, like things that were reflecting the image of the politician. And I think what people were hungry for was covering what's going on a local level that relates to the national level. So the idea that, and I think it was exacerbated when a lot of local news organizations closed. And so you'll talk to someone in Northeast Ohio, and they'll have been reading the coverage of the last 4 years of the Obama administration, where national press was saying, hey, we're in a recovery, things are doing better. And people around here would say, well, it's not as rosy as you're painting the picture to be. And so I think there was real dissonance in what people, I don't want to call it flyover country, but I'm using the shorthand, right? But in the middle of the country, people were feeling looked over by the national media, and I think they're right to feel that way. But there are a lot of sort of structural changes that I think led to that we now have to think about while also covering this guy who's pretty unusual.
Henry, it seems as though that same formula would apply to covering the election itself. The media missed it. They missed the Trump phenomenon. They thought he was a huckster and a showman and would flame out. He didn't. And I wonder if there's anything to the argument that some columnists have made that this is a reaction to the media allowing Trump essentially to gain a foothold, and now it's sort of a response to that.
I think it's too easy to blame the media for this, but certainly we didn't have our finer moments at points throughout the election. I think that to say we missed it, I think to Claire's point, Trump was really effective at creating these events and these moments that distracted us and that got us all bogged down in semantics and, do you take him literally or do you take him seriously became this like really bizarre debate that we were having over whether or not you should take what a presidential candidate is saying at face value. And we kind of got into this back and forth over words, and words matter, or emphasizing the more, I don't want to say dishonorable, but to the excerpt Ted just read, Donald Trump did say things that encouraged racist people. He did, and I think that the media had every responsibility to point that out, but it became a point where we were talking down to our readers, and we were saying, how could you vote for a racist? How could you vote for a nationalist? How could you vote for somebody that thinks these ways? And I'm being very broad in my language here, but, and I think that people who were hurting and who there was that dissonance between the national recovery but feeling underemployed or underpaid or underappreciated in your job, in quote unquote flyover country. I think that those readers, those voters, resented the mainstream media to a certain degree, telling them what was good for them and what was bad for them.
If I could just clarify there, I don't mean that we shouldn't report on those things, and I don't mean they're not serious issues, and I don't mean I even disagree with the guy. What I'm saying is that you report on what he said, you leave your opinion out of it. You don't say how could you vote for this guy. You put the information out there and let it go.
I think there was a tone to that though, and we didn't. I think we did that. I think we did do it the right way. But what I would hear from people that I would talk to at Trump rallies or Trump events was, they would read this coverage and they would think that we were calling them, just by pointing out the facts, they'd be like, well, I'm not a racist because I support Donald Trump. I don't hate all Mexicans. I don't hate all Muslims. We don't, just because we like Donald Trump, we're not a terrible person. By pointing out some of these uncomfortable things about the Trump campaign, I think it was making people feel self-conscious about their vote, and they took that out on us in a way, I feel like.
Because it was the presidential campaign in the most recent history that had explicit undertones or overtones of racism or nationalism. I will say, I also think what happens when we talk about the media is this one big blob of things, is there's lots of stuff going on in the media. I often think that we don't do a good enough job of differentiating who's an opinion person. Rachel Maddow is not a journalist. She's a person with an opinion show. Henry is a journalist, right? I think that there is some, I often think it happens on TV where you have to fill 24 hours. And so you get a lot of people who are saying their opinions, but people read it as news. And I also think you have a pretty bad phenomenon going on in internet reading where, yes, my editors will put an inflammatory headline sometimes on a piece that'll say, I think incorrectly, the only reason why people vote for Trump is because they're a racist. Not true, but then people will share it, and you'll see only that Facebook link or that Twitter link, and that's all you'll read, and then you'll comment on the article. And I do think that there is a certain amount of, it's certainly on us, but it takes two to tango. Readers have to be also conscious about, have you read to the end of the article? Do you know what this article is saying? Have you tried to grasp the nuance? I mean, it's certainly on us because it's our jobs, but it also, to participate in a democracy, you have to take some responsibility.
That gets to the business model of journalism as it is today. In one sense, you just mentioned essentially clickbait headlines. So if you write a headline that's salacious about Trump, you might be more likely to get more shares and more clicks. That's the business model. In addition, cable news has benefited greatly from Donald Trump's candidacy and presidency. And in fact, the coverage hasn't been what he said and reacting to it. It's setting up all the cameras because we think he's going to say something. And I wonder about that, John. In one sense, that also allowed him, while he complained about the negative coverage and the great coverage for his opponent, he also had what appeared to be unlimited airtime in order to make his case to his constituents. So talk about that media model and how that's playing into it, different today perhaps than it was, say, in the Watergate era.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And some scholars have estimated that Donald Trump, at least during the primaries, when he won the Republican nomination, got probably the equivalent of $2 billion worth of free airtime partly because he was covered obsessively, because he was good viewing, he was good reading, he was good listening, and he was good at it, right? He was good at getting people's attention. And this is occurring in a time in which there's great shifts in the media landscape, a lot of it having to do with technology, but frankly, a lot of it having to do with finances. You know, when we think of, at least when I think of the mid-20th century, and I think of the great newspapers, that many of which are not really with us anymore, these were newspapers that had an enormous amount of resources that they could put not only into reporting, but into editing their stories. And you know, in a lot of ways, the image that we have of quote-unquote unbiased news, of correct news, comes from that era. But part of what happened, there was a very different business model. As some of you may know, in the 19th century, newspapers were highly partisan. They were actually the arms of the political parties, and they couldn't be politically independent. But by the 1950s, most newspapers were supported by advertising cars and refrigerators and real estate. Now, that created its own set of problems, but it did provide a degree of political independence that reporters and editors could have that maybe they certainly didn't have before, and maybe they can't have today because of the shrinking revenues. And now it's much more, it's competition in a different way. And I think that's made it, two things has happened. One is it's made it extremely difficult to maintain those kinds of standards. But secondly, there's been a strong motivation to seek out special audiences. And your point, Mike, about how cable news done very well under the Trump era, because there are audiences, people who really want to hear a particular slant on the news.
Ted, you've talked about that. People are searching for news that affirms their point of view. Yeah. Whether you're a Fox News viewer or an MSNBC viewer, you're going there for a reason. Right. And you talked about the struggles at a newspaper that was trying to be down the middle, having difficulty doing that. What do you see in the future for journalism? Will everybody take a side?
I think it's already happening, and I think the diminishing of the newspaper as the go-to place for news and information is terrible for the democracy, because a newspaper, the editors not only did their best to make sure that stories were clear and unbiased and informational, but they would pick out a wide range of stories that people needed to know and perspectives that they needed to have to make informed decisions. And now when you're just going to Fox or to CNN or to somewhere where you know that you're going to find people who agree with you, that is lost. And I think, you know, the advertising John talked about is going away dramatically. For, you know, the classified sections, think of the classified sections of 20 years ago. That enabled us to have a 400-person newsroom at the Plain Dealer, where we were all over the place, and you knew what was going on with your local, government and businesses and everything else, and right on up to the present. Now, I worry that as we don't have the advertising revenue that pay for all those reporters, where does it come from, and how do you know who to trust, and how do you know they're not just giving you information that you want to hear, and really not covering things the way they need to be covered.
So how do you, Claire?
Well, I think the business model problem is a huge one, and you've seen in the months since Trump was elected, some online publications are, let's say slanting to the left or slanting to the right. So I think we all know Breitbart. It's got a lot of funding from the Mercer family, which are big Republican donors. But then you've also got sites like Slate, which I think used to be much more we're a magazine with maybe a general left tilt. But now they've sort of gone full tilt, we're anti-Trump, and it's good for their business model. What I would say is the newspapers that are surviving, maybe not robustly, are places where often families or foundations have treated them as a public trust. This is the same with lots of magazines. So you used to have the Graham family supporting the Washington Post, and now you've got Jeff Bezos. You have the Sulzbergers who have decided that that's what they want to do with the New York Times. But again, I'd say that works for national papers. But what about regional papers? So what about wealthy families in Ohio or Michigan who say, you know what, we're going to support, this is a public trust, we will be the family that will support the newspaper. Maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. It doesn't seem like it's working. But I think that newspaper coverage in the States, or whatever form news takes, maybe you endow a website to be a sort of down the middle place. I think in a lot of ways, maybe we're coming to the realization that It's not a great business model anymore. You can sell ads against video. A lot of reporters hate video. But what do you do to fund this model and make it work? And I think it's a really hard thing. And what seems to me what's working best are these family trust models.
Let's talk a little bit about how the media might be shooting its own self in the foot, either by racing to be first or because of this drive to sort of point out when things aren't truthful. You'll see things, for example, in the New York Times, where it says, here are the 150 times that the president lied in the last week, using the word lied. Or you'll see a coverage of a story that's a legitimate one, which is a release of a climate change report, but the thrust of that story is, and the president didn't want you to see it. A day later, the New York Times finds out it's been online since January, and they have to retract that and make a correction. So what about the media's own complicity in whenever it makes a mistake, it's amplified when before it was a mistake in a stream of correct stories? Henry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a friend of mine who's a very, very good national reporter was on pool reporting duty at the White House, I think on the first day of the Trump administration. And pool duty means, only a few reporters are allowed inside to cover what's happening and then send it out to all the other reporters who might be interested in news coming out of the White House. And this reporter made a mistake. It was a bad but honest mistake. And he tweeted out the one thing, and the one tweet got a bunch of retweets. And then when he tweeted out a tweet to correct it, barely anybody noticed it. And he felt horrible. He corrected, he apologized, he owned up to it, but it became so magnified because it was right in the wheelhouse of Trump's fake news claim. And then you mentioned the report, the New York Times report on the climate change report that was actually public. And so, yeah, we have to try even harder to be bulletproof in our reporting and our stories because there's even more pressure on us to get it right. I will say it's ironic to me that we make a mistake and it is full-blown nuclear from the White House, fake news, they always get it wrong. But when the president or somebody that works for him goes on TV and says something that is demonstrably false, there's just always this we're picking on them by pointing that out. It just, honesty and truth and accuracy is a two-way street, and we shouldn't forget that.
To your point, Mike, I think the media, and especially the Times, is really shooting itself in the foot by its determination to just excoriate the guy at every opportunity. There are lots of relevant stories to be done about what he's doing and how, but they're so eager to pin that on him that they end up having to make a correction. I think it's it's unfortunate because we need the New York Times. The New York Times is a great newspaper. They have reporters in places nobody else does now. But if they continue to do things like that, people begin to just not trust them more and more, and by their own doing, not by anything the president said.
And I want to clear up one thing. You said, to my point. I am an impartial and unbiased moderator here. So I was not making a point. I was simply...
Your question, I should have
Yes,
said.
I was giving you a topic of discussion. John Green?
But part of the problem, well, mostly we've been talking about the content of stories and whether they lean one way or another, whether they're complete and accurate. But part of the problem for many people is the choice of topics to be covered. Now, in Washington, D.C. right now, the Russian scandal is the top every minute of every hour of every day. But lots of people outside of Washington, even people who are civically minded, are interested in a lot of other things. They'd like to know, what about these promises on immigration that the president made? What about his changes with the EPA? How are we doing in terms of jobs? I mean, these are things that people think are important. And so leaving the content aside, when they turn to national media particularly, and they see a very narrow range of topics covered, it makes them wonder if those folks live in the same world they live in.
So what do you think then of President Trump's response to that, which is to hire a former anchor from CNN and create his own news program, which he's putting out on Facebook, so that when you watch that, you'll see the jobs numbers and you'll see the stock market going up. Some people have characterized that as looking like state television in some other countries. But others might say, listen, he's got to get the story out somehow and the media is not paying attention. How do you view it?
Well, I view it very negatively. But then that's just me. I think that one of the things about today's media environment is that everybody can publish their own newspaper and everybody can have their own TV program. And I don't know that it's inherently wrong for President Trump to have that, except what we need in the national discussion is voices that are alternatives to the president, because the president whoever the president is, and particularly this one, has a big megaphone. And so we need to hear the other side. And I think many of our colleagues in the media have hurt themselves because they've led many people to believe that there's not going to be honest differences of opinion and criticism of the president, but that it's actually just biased and hostile to him, regardless of what he says.
Today we're enjoying a Friday Forum panel discussion on bias, fake news, and the state of the Fourth Estate, featuring Ted Diadiun. He's a columnist and editorial writer for Cleveland.com. Henry Gomez, political reporter for BuzzFeed News, based here in Northeast Ohio. Clare Malone, senior political reporter for FiveThirtyEight, and Dr. John C. Green, director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our radio broadcast or webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, you can tweet it directly to @TheCityClub. Put the in there, @TheCityClub, and our staff will try to work that into the program. We want to remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point and should be questions. We have the first question now on the left side of the room there. Welcome.
Thank you very much. My question really is directed at journalism per se, and probably print journalism more than broadcast. Recently, there was a well-known college of journalism that was not accredited and kind of shrugged its shoulders and went on its way. They were not accredited because they were not talking anymore about objectivity. The illustration I would use that I I see frequently these days in print is reporters using words like retorted instead of replied. And this person that was telling me about this said, and she is well known in journalism, that objectivity is no longer a standard taught or striven for. Is that true?
It's a good question. And so let's put it to our panel, because I'm just an unbiased moderator. Clare Malone?
Well, Ted and I were talking when we met in the green room, the library. What's the City Club green room? The library.
It's not green at all.
Yeah. Before, yeah. Ted
Green was with us.
Yeah. was saying, where'd you start your journalism career? And Ted worked at newspapers, and I worked at a small magazine, and then I went to a bigger magazine, and have now gone to a website. But I did kind of get like farm league training, right? Someone sat me down at some point and said, you got to call the senator's office to fact check or give them a heads up. You got to do this and that. And one thing I do, I'll be perfectly honest, I don't really believe in journalism school. I don't believe in incurring that much student loan.
You don't believe it exists?
I do believe it exists.
It does exist.
Mike, it does exist. But I would say what's more important is, right, the same thing that journalism school does is instilling facts. I would find that worrisome if they're not talking to people about what we were saying before, the difference between people being biased but also trying to be objective in your coverage. But I do think that because of the changing, splintering business model of journalism, there are fewer farm league places, fewer smaller newspapers where you can be a young reporter and get someone to actually give you some face-to-face time and teach you stuff. I don't know. I mean.
Well, Henry, you were trained at Youngstown State. I was at Bowling Green. They drilled it into our heads that you can't write a story until you get the other side. You will make that effort. If you don't get it, you'll then at least explain how you tried. Is that a different formula than what we're seeing come out of school now or young journalists? Because I don't necessarily see that, but
It was a long time ago for me, and an even longer time ago for you.
Really?
back in school. But
didn't we graduate the same year?
and they were writing it on the cave walls when Ted was there. So, but no, I think I would dispute that objectivity is no longer a principle adhered to in professional journalism. The reporters who are younger than I am, who come up in, all seem to have a sense of right and wrong. I mean, the example you used with retorted, I think sometimes we err on the side of just having punchier language, and it's not about a personal bias or not. And luckily, I've had editors over the years who have beat those types of loaded words out of my copy before they made them into print. And it wasn't so much a bias as it was, retorted does sound a little sexier than replied sounds, and I don't know, sometimes I think that the reporter who has been doing this long enough or who's covered a subject long enough, like I covered John Kasich for years. I know that guy's mannerisms and his personality pretty well, and I could tell the difference between a John Kasich retort and a John Kasich reply. And John Kasich retorts a lot, by the way. But and so I do think sometimes, and I don't think that's subjective. I think that's a good reporter who knows his subject and has put in the work and has the experience and the institutional memory on a subject. I think they have the trust and the license to write with that authority.
Yeah,
But,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Ted.
I'd agree with that. I think that the experienced reporters and good editors will allow some life into copy and trust the reporter's experience and his view of things. But it's troubling to hear that they're not even teaching. Now, I don't even know if there are print journalism schools anymore. But that they wouldn't be teaching objectivity and the importance for a balanced report. But when you have a media columnist like the piece I just read, which was endorsed by his editor, Dean Baquet, I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Dean
Baquet. I think that's troubling because he's saying objectivity is out the window when it comes to this president.
But I guess the school was not accredited, so that's a good.
Yeah, well,
that's a good
that
sign.
is good. But that's anyway. I think that's still important in our news organization, and the difficulty is that we don't have those acerbic editors with the vigor that we used to because of the staff cuts and other things.
Even if people,
Real
go ahead,
brief
John.
story.
Yeah.
I was many years ago got to work with a really great journalist who wrote for the Chicago Tribune, and that, as some of you may know, the Tribune had a very famous sort of dry, spare style. And he told me that when he first went to work there, he always wanted to put adjectives and adverbs in his copy, and they would take them out. and he just got really frustrated once. And the story he told me is he went to his editor and said, I just can't do this. And the editor said, you know what you should do? You should write, when you feel compelled to have an adjective, put in the word damn, and then we'll take it out. And then we'll be fine. Anyway, just a little story about that.
Before we get to the next question, even if people are trying to be a journalist who does not show bias, who gets both sides, does it matter that I don't know if I've come across, I would say, more than a handful of people in this business who say they think Trump is a great guy?
Yeah.
I wonder, does that matter at all in regards to the crew of journalists who are covering this administration? Down the line, you don't, and it's not necessarily a Republican or Democrat thing. It seems to be a Trump thing. You'll see coverage of his golf game, that he drives his golf cart up onto the green and he takes mulligans, and it becomes Dana Milbank's column in the Plain Dealer today. Does it matter that people generally in the media don't seem to like Donald Trump?
Well, I guess there's an argument that if you know where the person is coming from and you do have their opinion, at least it gives you a perspective on what they're reporting and how to read it. But I think you're right. I mean, I'm a conservative and I'm not a Trump fan, and I know a lot of people like me, so I don't know that. Go ahead.
I mean, whether somebody's a good person or not, I think we all have our opinions of that. And I think you mentioning the example of the coverage of Trump's golfing habits probably is an example where that might manifest itself a little bit more. But we all know which politicians are great, virtuous people, and we also know the ones that are kind of shady and say things that aren't true. And I think the difference is Trump does everything on steroids, right? So it's so much more magnified that it's not. Again, it's hard to compare Trump to anybody else we've covered, I think.
I think we have our headline, Trump's on steroids.
Yeah, sorry. Take me seriously, not literally. Or what? I always get those two confused.
Let's get our next question. Bruce Akers.
Two-part question. Most of your discussion today has been on print media. I'm curious of the panel's feeling. Do they feel that television, and maybe radio too, but particularly television, is a little more balanced in its coverage about fake news, or not much difference. The second part is you occasionally run into these fact-check columns where you take something that's been said and then the facts come out. Who puts those together, and why should the doubting public think that's any more objective than anything else?
A couple of great questions. First of all, the question about whether television or broadcast media is doing a better job of not showing bias. Henry's chuckling. It seems. Maybe it was a hiccup.
I think that we paint TV with this broad brush and have to realize that there's different flavors of television, even on the same network. I mean, MSNBC has a pretty straight lineup throughout the day of unbiased, like, news reporters who are anchoring shows and interviewing newsmakers and hitting the big stories of the day. But then when MSNBC gets into prime time, it's, you have Rachel Maddow, who comes at you from clearly a left point of view, and you have Chris Hayes and Lawrence O'Donnell, who are similar. And same with Fox News, which starts with Fox and Friends, which is what gets the president going every morning. And they do have some anchors throughout the day who tend to hew more toward a straight news approach, but then you get to primetime again, and it veers off more to the right. CNN, I mean, they try to come at it, I guess, more down the middle than most, but I think that they are picking stories that they think are going to keep your attention longer, and sometimes that's not exactly the most relevant story of the day.
It seems to me that cable television is what's really being painted as the dividing line here, that it isn't unbiased. In fact, it's purposefully biased. Do you agree with that, Claire?
Yeah, it's purposely biased, and I think the problem is more people get their news from TV than do from print. And I think a broader swath of America, income, education, racial, diversity, more people watch TV. And I think there are definitely some great reporters on TV, but by and large, I find that they often will cannibalize other people's coverage or invite talking heads on to go at each other. So I do think inevitably it's skewed. And in some ways, if we want to improve the media environment, even though I'm kind of I don't really love television news, if you want to reach more people, you want to have, smart news. And in some ways, radio programs, you can have people call in, like actual people call in and sort of voice their opinions. That's a pretty good medium. But cable probably is, yeah. I'm sucking up to the host, but it is true. I mean, it's also like to go back to the point of regionalism, where do those shows exist? I mean, you've got drive time shows, which don't really count, but local talk stations.
On the point about fact checking, interesting thing, in the Plain Dealer, they were running these fact checks. And when you write what somebody says and then say, wrong, here's the real truth, wrong, here's the real truth, people see that as biased, even if what you're saying is the truth. Instead, if you ran a box next to it that simply said, here are the facts as it relates to immigration numbers, they're facts that are verifiable facts, people might look at that and then say, okay, I'll make my own decision about whether what the person quoted is saying the truth. So maybe it's an approach about fact checking. The question is, who is doing the fact check too?
I think I used to be a fact checker, actually, so this is near and dear to my heart. But I think I think it cuts to a real problem that you might not trust a fact check column. And I would say the one good thing about, let's say if you're reading it online, are there links that you can click to in the article that take you to an original source? So some of it is you can check it yourself. But I think it falls to the fact checker columnist to say, this is where I got those numbers from, and to not skew the context of the numbers. I think that if you're running a really good, good faith fact check column, you'll have the sources. It won't just be your statement. It'll be a heavily sourced column that says, this is the context of the numbers, this is the history of the comment. Because oftentimes you can have, everyone knows this, you can skew a number. So I think it's also important to provide readers, if there's history or political, a fraught political battle surrounding a fact, talk about it.
Mike, I think there are two problems with the fact-checking apparatus, and a lot of people do this, but there are two problems. One is when the bottom line of the fact-checking is to make a value judgment about a person, right? This person's wrong. Well, they may have had their facts wrong, but that's different than saying that the person's wrong. So I think there's a personalizing to this that could easily lead people to the conclusion that this has a bias, even if the underlying facts were very correct. The other piece of it, though, is one has to understand that fact-checking has to have multiple sources. And that's why, as was being pointed out, a multiple sourced fact-checking column is much, much more valuable than one that has just one source. Or the ones I like or don't like are the as everybody knows.
I kind of feel like fact-checking, like the feature fact-check, the stuff that's like a standalone item on as a fact-check, like PolitiFact or Fact Checker or the Washington Post Pinocchio's thing. I think that kind of reminds me of like the home run derby at the baseball all-star game. Like years ago, it was really this cool novel thing, and then for a while, it just became so bloated and so there was just too much. It went on for like 4 hours. It just a good thing became too much, and I think that the fact-checking features are kind of becoming that. Everybody's doing them. They do lend themselves to sort of a cartoonish or gimmicky thing to help them stand out from the next one, when in reality, any good journalist should be fact-checking in real time as they're reporting their stories. And if somebody blurts out a false statistic or fact in a debate or an event, I think that you should not hammer it over the head in the story you write, but you should point out, the senator said that this happened, but actually this is what, you know what I mean? So I just feel like we've gone out of our way to do these things, and they're just not, they're sort of outliving their usefulness, perhaps, in their format.
We used to do a thing called PolitiFact at PolitiFact Ohio. It was a part of a larger nationwide effort. And there was a lot of rigorous reporting that went into the reporting of that. We'd take an issue and really burrow into it and report all these facts. And as you said, a lot of it was nuanced. It wasn't exactly wrong, and it wasn't exact, but I mean, it would I think, for by and large, do a pretty nice job of explaining the situation, what had happened, where the person was right, where he was wrong, and then we would wrap it all up with this stupid thing called the truth-o-meter, and we would put
Pants on fire? Was that?
Yeah,
was
pants
that
on fire was the worst, and then it went true, mostly true, and they're all. But the problem was that you took this nuanced story that was really good reporting and worthwhile, and slap a tag on it, and then everything people saw underneath that was filtered through that peg, and it just colored it. I argued to get rid of that thing and unsuccessfully, but I think that was part of the problem. Well, no, I meant the truth-o-meter. I thought the PolitiFact was pretty good. But.
One of the things that fact-checking has given rise to that I've noticed is that when you're hearing two people have an argument at the pub, you now hear someone say, "Cite your sources." Like somebody's gonna be able to do that in the middle of an argument at McCarthy's Ale House, but they'll try. But interesting that at least people are saying there should be a basis for the argument that you're making. So you have this little computer in your pocket. I don't know if you guys know about it. There's a phone. You can check stuff out on there at any time and get your details. Next question, please. Yes, sir.
Well, this is going to be a follow-up, Mike, to what you just said, I believe. We've been hearing for at least the last 6 months about charges of the Trump campaign colluding with the Russians. What seems to be overlooked in all that coverage is the fact that the Russians have meddled in our election process. They have put out fake news, admittedly fake news when you look at it. My question to the panel is, how do each of you seek to verify what it is you're reporting as being accurate?
Claire?
Well, you look up at primary sources, right? So you don't take if a person is in an interview, well, there are lots of different instances, but let's say someone's leaking you a document or saying, in the case of, there are Russian bots that are propagating fake news in Wisconsin. Okay, what's your proof? And then there's digital scrubbing that you do with lots of this stuff. Can you direct it back? Can you get someone who's a cybersecurity expert to verify what this person is saying? And does the cybersecurity expert have a point of view? So there's some of that, which to the Russia stuff is pretty complicated, but on a more straightforward day-to-day reporting basis, if someone gives you a quote and cites something about an agency or a political circumstance or whatever it is, you obviously go back and you go into Nexus and you pull up the news story from way back when, or if you're talking about White House reporting or political campaigns reporting and someone tells you, off the record or on background, this is a thing, you don't just immediately put it in your story. You have to confirm with a couple other sources who will go, who will be more on the record with you. So, and maybe, those are things that go into a news story, and maybe we're not transparent enough as reporters about the steps that go through to make a news story. It's one thing that I think is hard. Like David Fahrenthold, I think, became pretty well known to people throughout the election because he was doing pretty straightforward reporting, right? Which was, Trump said he gave to all these charities. Well, I'm going to make a list of all of them and call them all, cross it off a list, and say whether or not he actually gave to the charities. And he would take pictures of his legal pad every day and say, this is the note, cross off that. And you could see his reporting as it went through. That's great. And I think when possible with that kind of reporting where actually crowdsourcing can help a reporter, you should maybe try to be more transparent, let people actually know what we're doing. The problem is you can't do that with all kinds of reporting, obviously. Some stuff is sensitive information, and reporters, I think, weigh whether or not you want to let something out. For whatever Trump says about leaks, I think that newspapers are often convinced by governmental agencies we're going to withhold certain pieces of information because it might be dangerous. So I think when possible, we should be more transparent about what goes into fact-checking and vetting stories. But there's also has to be an understanding that you can't do that with every story because you're going to blow sources or, frankly, blow a scoop.
You mentioned leaks, and the president usually says whenever it's a leak that's something that's damaging the democracy, and whenever it's an anonymous source, it's fake news by its very nature.
Right.
What about that part of it, Henry, when you're talking about checking your sources and telling the public that you're telling the truth, but your source is an anonymous person who leaked you a document?
Well, I think that you have to evaluate all those things on a case-by-case basis. How relevant is the document to the public's right to know? How trustworthy is the source? Can you verify it from one or more sources who can testify to the legitimacy or the validity or the accuracy of the document? If we're talking about a document, if we're talking about like a stray tip, like so-and-so got fired for this, or then it requires a critical mass of reporting. And I'm fortunate to work in a pretty big newsroom that has a lot of reporters in Washington who, if you have something like that come through, you have a bunch of different people with different sources that can check on those things. And, ultimately it's a judgment call by the reporter and the editor or editors above them on whether or not the information is solid for reporting. And we work hard to make sure that it is.
Let's have another question from our audience. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. I taught English language arts for 40 years, and I'm very concerned about journalism and what it has become. When I talk to some young people, a lot of them are not as excited about being president, and a number of them are not as excited about being journalists because they don't feel like it's really a noble profession that it used to be. So my question to you is, how would you convince students that journalism is really still important?
Talking to a bunch of grizzled veterans that are like, don't get into business. But we love it. But everyone up here, I think, loves the work that they do, and professors too. So we're going to end with that question, but can we get some pretty brief responses, but a response to how do you motivate young people that this is a noble profession?
Well, as a college professor, what I would say to those students is there's lots of room to improve the really important role that journalists play in a democracy. We may be at a kind of difficult moment, but it can be a lot better, and you can be the person that helps this become a more noble profession. By the way, it's already a noble profession, but to become even a more noble one.
I don't want to. We don't know where this Russia investigation's going to end up, but already I think that the reporting on it has brought things to light that have pushed the investigation forward in a direction that it probably needs to go. It needs to go before people have accurate answers. I mean, when the president fires the FBI director, but then the FBI director or when Comey or his allies then start, filtering out documents to reporters to make sure that side gets out there and it triggers a grand jury investigation. I would motivate your students by saying the process does. When it works well, and it gets action, and it gets results. And I think that we're seeing that incrementally on some of these stories already in the new administration.
Claire?
It's sad to hear that, but I would say maybe one thing to say to those students is, great, then this is an industry that has a lot of room for you to improve it and to point them towards I think probably maybe what a high schooler is reading online might be a lot of trashy news, and that's a bummer. So, pointing them towards the best part of journalism, the cream of the crop, and saying, yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff out there now as far as reporting goes, but this is what it can be, and in some ways there's a lot of room for you to better it as you go along. Because I do think, it's written into our Constitution, right? There aren't any other professions that are in that document that protect us in that way.
And there is a lot of great stuff out there. It didn't end at Watergate. There's amazing reporting, both local and national. When you find it, when you read it, when you read the narratives, when you read the investigative reporting, you can get blown away by that. So if people are reading the right things, perhaps. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a Friday Forum panel discussion on bias, fake news, and the state of the Fourth Estate. Today's forum is the WCLV Forum, endowed by Robert and Jean Conrad. We're delighted Robert is with us today. Thank you for your continued support of City Club programming. We welcome today guests at tables hosted by Malone Law, LLC, and the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. Additionally, we welcome students from Flow Homeschool Co-op. Support for student participation in City Club forums is provided by many foundations, including the William E. Weiss Foundation. We thank all of you for being here today. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Ted, Henry, Dr. Green, and Claire, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned as soon as Claire leans over and bangs the gong.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.